Hello, and welcome to our event this evening, Getting Through It, Resilience Through Cancer, with our author this evening, Helen Epstein, joined in conversation by Dr. Ira Brenner. My name is Katira Noviello Kapoor, and I am the Senior Director of Health Promotion, Wellness, and Athletics at the 92nd Street Y. Thank you again so much for being with us this evening. Just a short introduction, and then we can get right into this, a very informative discussion. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit North America in March 2020, day-to-day activities such as taking public transportation, running errands, and going for medical checkups suddenly seemed like life or death decisions. Like thousands of Americans, Helen Epstein weighed the risks of contracting the virus and decided against a routine medical checkup. A few weeks later, a streak of blood in her underwear made it clear that something was going on that shouldn't be ignored. After a gamut of tests and a uterine biopsy, the diagnosis was delivered over the phone: endometrial cancer. In this new book, Helen brings readers along on her journey through a medical steeplechase of surgery, chemo, and radiation therapy, led by an almost all female team of doctors, nurses, techs, and support staff. She also highlights the moments and tools that supported her in overcoming cancer, such as maintaining a sense of humor and maintaining a connection to friends and family. Getting Through It gives a voice to the experience of the estimated 100,000 plus American women diagnosed with gynecological cancer every year. So I don't know about you, but I am very much looking forward to hearing about this discussion and everything that Helen has to share with us. I would now like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Ira Brenner. Dr. Brenner is clinical professor of psychiatry at Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University and training and supervising analyst at the Psychoanalytical Center of Philadelphia. He has a special interest in psychic trauma and the mind-body connection. Dr. Brenner has authored over 100 publications, co-edited 3 special issues of the International Journal of Applied Psychoanalytic Studies, and has published 6 books, including The Last Witness, The Child Survivor of the Holocaust, Disassociation of Trauma, Psychic Trauma, Injured Men, Dark Matters, Exploring the Realm of Psychic Devastation, and the Handbook of Psychoanalytic Holocaust Studies, International Perspectives. Dr. Brenner, welcome and thank you for being with us this evening. I'll hand it over to you to introduce our main guest, Helen.
Thank you very much, Katira. I am very pleased to be here and participate in this extremely important event. Getting the diagnosis of cancer is, for many people, one of the worst days of their lives. Generally, bad news could be the worst possible news. It could be life-threatening news. To get this news during the early months of COVID, which we would like to forget already, which has been over 2 years ago, is the worst possible time to have been diagnosed with this condition. I know for myself, just having to make arrangements to have the skin cancer removed was enormously complicated and had to be delayed. So I can only imagine what our dear friend Helen Epstein had to go through. And we'll be hearing about this very, very soon. Helen is a veteran journalist, acclaimed author of the nonfiction trilogy, Children of the Holocaust, Where She Came From, A Daughter's Search for Her Mother's History, and The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma. To give you an idea of the quality of her writing and the impact that she has had, her book on Children of the Holocaust basically became the manifesto for the whole second generation movement. Extremely influential, extremely detailed, and when you read her work, she brings you along with her experience. Helen was born in Prague. She grew up in Manhattan, where she attended Hunter High School, City College, before graduating from Hebrew University and the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. She's an award-winning journalist and former New York journalism professor whose writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Jerusalem Post, Boston Globe, New York, and NewYorker.com. I'm very pleased to be here this evening to discuss this newest book of hers, her accomplishment, and most importantly, her survival. The title of her book, Getting Through It, My Year of Cancer During COVID. And again, let me just emphasize that more than 40% of people during this period of time delayed or avoided or couldn't get medical care. And as time went on, it became closer to 70%. So again, as Katera said, this is a steeplechase and a struggle for survival. And with Helen's resilience and her capacity to write about her experience, it is truly a pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight, Helen. And maybe you can start us off by just telling us a little bit about these early moments, these early days.
Well, thank you so much, Ira, for such a nice introduction. So I was in March of 2020 about to set off on a book tour because I had just annotated my late mother's war memoir about how she survived the Holocaust. And her publishing date was March 12th. And I was about to go to this bookstore to start the book tour, and instead everything was canceled. And I had several dental appointments, eye doctor appointments, routine medical tests, and I canceled all of them as well. I live outside of Boston in a town called Lexington. My hospital is Massachusetts General, and for me to get most of my tests, I go into town, into Boston. And given that the outbreak here in Boston was very swift, and by March people were very scared, I thought it was the better part of wisdom not to have the tests. So, as you said, I joined the many thousands of people who canceled their tests until I discovered that I had a symptom which I knew about. I knew that having blood in your underwear was not a good thing, no matter what. And I said, I better call the doctor. So I called my GYN. My GYN scheduled my routine ultrasound of my uterus and discovered a suspiciously thickened endometrial lining. I then had an endometrial biopsy, and I was diagnosed with cancer very quickly. All of this happened unbelievably quickly because so many people had canceled both their tests and their doctor's appointments. So I wound up having less than a month between the time I was diagnosed and the time I was on the operating table.
So often I hear from friends and family and people that I work with clinically that the waiting game, the whole notion of the diagnosis, the blood work, the biopsies, the imaging tests, the repeat biopsies, the uncertainty, the second opinion, the third opinion, all of these steps and the management of anxiety and uncertainty and the disbelief, like the way you were saying, you saw the blood and you knew it was not a good sign. So often people don't want to or can't believe their eyes when they see something like blood. Is it really blood? Was it chocolate? Who knows? But the idea that one has to confront the reality that there could be something seriously wrong, especially at a time like this. What was that like for you, Helen?
Well, as I said, I actually wrote down the dates so you get a sense of how quick it was. I called the GYN for the bleeding on May 27th. I had the endometrial biopsy June 5th. I had the result June 10th. And 2 weeks later, I had the surgery.
Wow.
And less than a month later, I was in chemo.
Yeah.
So I really had none of the time that most people have for anxiety or for disbelief. Because we were all at home and because I have a very, very numbers-oriented partner, my husband is an engineering type, it was clear to both of us that we were in a situation that required immediate action. Perhaps if it had happened not during COVID, we would have looked around for a second opinion, but we didn't feel we had any time to spare. I should also say that age is a variable in the whole cancer equation. If you're 30 years old, or if you're 50 years old, or if you're 70 years old, you will look at cancer in a different way. And in my case, having endometrial cancer when I was after 70 years old made things very clear. I didn't have to worry about fertility issues. I didn't have to think very hard about whether I wanted to keep my ovaries or not, which are major issues for a woman in her 30s or even in her 40s. Because, of course, when you have your ovaries taken out, you go into instant menopause. I was already in menopause, so this was not an issue for me. One of the great lines in my book is when my surgeon asks me, "How do you feel about your appendix?" Because she had listed all of the things she was taking out of my body, and I thought about it for about 2 minutes, and I thought, I don't really care about my appendix. My brother had just had an appendectomy a couple of years before, and I thought I might as well avoid that. So I said, "Sure, take it out." And then I asked her, am I going to miss all this stuff? It seems like an awful lot of stuff to take out. She took out my uterus, my cervix, my fallopian tubes, my ovaries, and my appendix. And I said, "Will I feel empty?" And she said, "Nah, think of it like a sock drawer. You take out 6 pairs of socks, and it looks pretty much the same, doesn't it?" And that, in fact, is the truth.
Yeah. There is so much we could say about what it was like for you to lose those very important parts of your body. And maybe we can come back to that a little bit later, because I know that's essential, absolutely essential for women of all ages, for men of all ages, for anyone who loses their vital private parts. It's absolutely crucial part of coping and loss and a basic part of our identities. But you mentioned your surgeon, and throughout your book and our conversations, your relationship with the surgeon looms so brightly. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how important it is to select a surgeon that you're comfortable with, the whole issue of trust, and the openness, the capacity, because we know that sometimes surgeons are known to not be that engageable, shall we say, as attentive to the patient as they are to the organs that the surgeon is tending to. You seem to have a particularly important relationship with your surgeon. Tell us about that, please.
Well, for me, I know that many people don't care whether their surgeon is a man or a woman. For me, it was terribly important that I have a woman. And it turned out to be really important that she was pretty much in my demographic. She was a liberal. She was a bit of a hippie. She had tattoos on her arms, and she operated in cowboy boots, which I found endearingly quirky and weird. But I looked her up online, of course, and she was one of the most qualified people in the Boston area. So despite all her quirkiness, she had a very solid resume. I really, really hit it off with her. And as I went through the medical process, I realized how completely changed the medical world has become over the last 25 years. There were women everywhere. There were women in the operating room. There were women in every facet of the hospital hierarchy. And I really felt like I belonged there. And I really understood why it was so important to have representatives of every group in the hospital setting. So I really understood if I had been an African American or an Asian or an LGBT person, how important it would have been to see someone like myself in the hospital setting. That was the first thing. The second thing is that the rules of the medical world have changed tremendously. And the medical staff was extremely open to questions. So anything I asked, I got an answer to from everybody, from technicians, from nurses, from my surgeon, from my oncologist. Along the way, I actually had a couple of strokes. So I met all kinds of other people. I met neurologists and I met emergency staff when I was in the hospital for the strokes. And I have to say, I felt very, very well taken care of. I felt totally trusting of the environment. And mostly, I remember it was during COVID. So this whole medical structure became my social life as well as my medical life. These were the people I was talking to for a year. They were almost the only people I was talking to on a regular basis for a year. And so I got to know them quite well. And I was really fascinated by them. And I also thought they were unbelievably brave. You know, people tell me that they think I was brave for going through this during COVID. Well, my medical staff was in the hospital every single day exposed to COVID.
You highlight the absolute importance of the doctor-patient relationship. And I commend you and your whole treatment team for being able to establish that, because perhaps under more peacetime conditions, more normative conditions, so often we hear that there's a certain variability, fluctuation, leaving one doctor, going to another doctor. I know there was a time when the doctor-patient relationship was taught in medical schools to be absolutely central to any kind of care that's being ministered to the patient, and that we were taught to cultivate that relationship, not just in psychotherapy, not just in my field of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, but in all medical fields. The doctor-patient relationship is essential. And again, I don't think you or I can emphasize enough the importance of trust. Basic trust, the thing that Erik Erikson had talked about as the basic element in all relationships, to be able to trust your doctor. So that's extremely, extremely valuable and necessary. You also emphasize the importance of your treatment partner. That I believe in your chronicle, in your entry, in the July 16th, 2020 entry in your book, you say very simply and very clearly, a patient should never attend a consult alone. And I think you talk about a specific example there. I think it was a chemotherapy consultation, but I think in general, I think that illustrates the important aspects of having a treatment partner, whether it's your spouse or someone else that's important to you. Tell us some more about that, if you could.
Absolutely. I am very lucky that my partner became my treatment partner, partly because, again, we were both housebound. But I have other friends whose treatment partner was a relative, or in one case, a friend, or even in one case, a housekeeper. It doesn't really matter who your partner is as long as you trust them implicitly. And that treatment partner is really your backup person, your coach, your alter ego. Very often during the cancer tunnel, as you're navigating all of this incredibly complicated new information, you just miss something. For example, I was told early on that I had grade 3 cancer, which is the most aggressive kind of cancer. It's similar to ovarian cancer. And I totally missed that. I focused on the fact that it was stage 1A, which I'm sure in therapy we'd say is a self-protective omission. But at any rate, I missed it. And my husband did not miss it. He wrote it down. I was taking notes too, but I managed not to write that down. The important thing is when you are going through cancer treatment, you are having to deal with so much new stuff and so many new feelings that it's absolutely impossible not to get overwhelmed. Even though I'm a trained journalist and I took notes, sometimes my notes were wrong, sometimes I couldn't read my notes, and sometimes things just went right over my head. And that's where my partner backed me up. Now, of course, he couldn't come into the room with me. He was parked in a garage near the hospital and he phoned in from the roof of the garage. But he was taking notes in the car as I was taking notes in the consult room. You have to imagine this. You know, I'm in a mask, my doctor's in a mask and in a plastic shield, so we can't really read each other's faces. And then my partner is up on the roof of the garage. So it was a very unusual situation.
The need for a medical advocate, even under less dire circumstances, I think is the take-home message here.
Hmm.
And as you say, no matter how prepared you are, even if you come with a list of notes, it's overwhelming. There's just so much anxiety, so much sweat, tears, all kinds of emotions that come up unexpectedly, no matter how prepared we think we are. Our lives are on the line. We may fear our lives are on the line. And this whole idea of cancer, I think as you began to tell us, because you had uterine cancer, and typically we think uterine cancer is not as potentially ominous as ovarian cancer can be, you gave yourself good news. We now know, we're now thinking that it's not so much the organ of origin, but the cell type that is much more important in cancer treatment. And we are having incredible breakthroughs with personalized therapy and genotyping, but it's still in its infancy and is still a very, very dangerous, very tricky disease. And for those of us who have been around over 2 centuries, we remember when the word cancer was not even whispered because it was an almost definite death sentence. There was hardly any differentiation. You had cancer, you had cancer. And I think there are vestiges that people still keep the C word a secret. You're not like that. I think part of your strength, part of your resilience, part of how you have adapted, coped, and triumphed is through communication, through writing, through the networks. So you had a system. You developed a system. You talked to friends. You talked to family. There may have been some surprises. Some may have been some very good surprises, maybe some not good surprises. Uh, how did all that affect you? How did you come up with the system that you did? And what advice would you have for people?
Well, as many of you know, I'm the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Certainly, Ira, you know this. And I wrote one of the first books about intergenerational transmission of trauma. And at the time, it was not talked about. People didn't talk about being Holocaust survivors. They didn't talk about being descendants of Holocaust survivors. There weren't Holocaust centers in every city. There weren't Holocaust departments in universities. I was really breaking a taboo. So I had had the experience of already writing about a shameful and a silent topic. Now, GYN cancer is similar in the sense that people now talk about breast cancer. Breast cancer is quite out there on the public stage. There are all kinds of organizations. People even talk about brain cancer. But for some reason, there's been this consistent silence and shame around GYN cancer, maybe because Americans are still puritanical and they don't like talking about their genitals. But at any rate, I felt like I was breaking a shameful secret by writing about it. And I had already done that before. So that didn't feel that strange to me. The other thing was, this is for shout out for my New York friends. I went to a wonderful public high school for girls called Hunter College High School. And it's now co-ed, but at the time I went there, it was all girls. And as soon as I knew I was in this for a year, I immediately let all my friends and former classmates from high school know. And of course, it being an all-girls high school, something like somewhere from 30 to 50% of my class had already had cancer. And so they could write to me of their experiences. A couple of them were themselves physicians, and a couple of them had GYN cancer at the same time I did. So that was a tremendous sense of support. So both the writing itself and the support that it got me from friends through responses to what I wrote was just invaluable. And again, there's the question of trust. I trusted my doctor, I trusted my spouse, and I had tremendous trust in this circle of friends who really came through for me and allowed me to basically set the terms of our engagement. So I wrote to every one of them and everyone in my family, please do this. Don't ask me lots of questions. Don't give me advice. Please just bring food and lots of chocolate. So I guess on top of the trust issue and the speaking issue, the communication issue, and telling people rather than keeping it a secret, I think I would add making clear what you need. You know, different people need different things. Some people might want to be given lots of advice. I really didn't. I was having a hard enough time understanding all of the information that I was being deluged with. I didn't want to hear from anybody else. And when my former classmates, you know, who were veterans of cancer, would send me long emails detailing what I should be doing, I would just save them for a later date. And sure enough, you know, half a year later, when I got to that stage of my treatment, I'd remember the email, I'd open it up, and I'd read it. But everybody, I have to say, was extremely understanding. You know, they really took my lead. And I'd say to all of you who are accompanying somebody going through cancer treatment, pay attention to what they tell you, because they'll tell you what they need. And, you know, people need very different things. Some people need to be left alone. Some people need to be called every day.
Right.
It really varies.
And I understand there are certain online programs or apps where people can sign up to provide meals, provide support, provide good wishes and prayers, so that even without an extensive pre-made network, there are things available that people can utilize to generate these kinds of networks. And I think the network of talking to fellow travelers who have been through some version of the kind of cancer that you had, to the kinds of procedures that you had, to all the questions, even if you weren't asking for advice, to know that you're not alone. There's a certain consensual validation, because this can be very, very, very lonely. And I've heard from many men who've gone through prostate cancer that there's an analogous kind of network that goes on. But I think we know typically women are much better at networking. And I think you're illustrating that quite beautifully. It is so easy to feel sick when one walks into a doctor's office feeling healthy and getting bad news. You walk in and you felt fine before, and before you know it, you've aged 20 years and you feel sick. This is natural. We call this regression. And the worst thing that can happen is to get stuck in that sick, passive patient mode. And unfortunately, Western medicine, in many ways, reinforces that. I think it takes a lot of advocacy and a lot of effort, self-agency, and a healthy assertiveness to fight that. because the more we feel like a passive victim, where someone who we didn't know before, we're giving them permission to cut open our vital organs, take out our private parts, and fill us with poison chemicals, zap us with radiation, to feel that one has no agency, that one is simply a passive victim, does not bode well for one's recovery. The more one can feel as though he or she or they are an active participant in this process, I think is extremely, extremely important. You exemplify that, Helen. You have done all kinds of things. You write about it beautifully. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I have to say, I was very lucky both in my spouse and my doctor, because neither of them leaned on me to do anything. I felt that I had a choice about what treatment I was going to accept and what treatment I wasn't going to accept. For some reason, which isn't very logical, because of course, when you're going through this, you lose logic, flies out the window. You're prey to whatever fantasies you've had before. My fantasy, my worst fantasy, was I was terrified of radiation, which turned out to be the least difficult part of the treatment.
Hmm.
But I was terrified of radiation. Why? Because I grew up in the 1950s going to nuclear bomb shelters. I remember the Twilight Zone. I remember the Neville Shute novel On the Beach. And I don't forget all of the nuclear explosions that have happened over the last couple of years or the last couple of decades. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, the Japanese nuclear reactor. So nuclear reactors were very much on my mind when I thought about radiation therapy, and I resisted it for a long time. Um, it was very hard for me to get over it, but my doctor and my husband just backed off and didn't pressure me at all, which was very smart of them. And I came to realize, mostly through my brother. I have a younger brother who had prostate cancer, and he had basically the male version of the radiotherapy that I had. It's called brachytherapy. And he helped me realize that, again, without pressuring me at all, just sharing information, that this really was not a big deal. And my radiation therapy turned out, as I said, to be the least difficult part of my therapy. And yet it occupied a huge amount of mental stress for me. I just refused to do it for a long time. And I delayed it. It was the very last part of my therapy.
I like the way that you've shared with us how you've been able to examine the source of some of your fears about radiation therapy. Um, they're not irrational, but they're not they're very understandable, but it's not the kind of radiation therapy, the focused, very, very precise radiation therapy that's provided today. And the reason why I want to bring this to your and the listeners' attention is that your self-awareness, your capacity to sort of look at these things, is an extremely important ingredient and quality in resilient people. All of the studies that are out there in terms of what are the qualities in resilience, what are the kinds of things that we can hopefully try to teach people to become more resilient. And this whole issue of resilience became much more prominent after September 11th, because we all witnessed the destruction of the towers, bombing of the Pentagon, and we all got traumatized to some degree simply by watching something. So the concern that we now have a traumatized country, how do we bounce back? What is important in resilience? How do we teach it? Self-awareness, being aware of oneself, how one's mind works, how we think, what we're afraid of, what's rational fear, what's somewhat irrational fear. This quality of self-awareness is absolutely essential. Networking is important. Having an optimistic attitude is important. Having a problem-solving capacity is important. Being able to think clearly under pressure and in a healthy way compartmentalize our paralyzing fears and anxieties and emotions, but not so deeply to put them away in that iron box that you've written about, uh, that we can't retrieve them when we're needed, but to somehow be able to compartmentalize things a little bit so that we can make proper decisions.
I think there's one other thing, and that is a consciousness of what's going on in the world outside of yourself or your community or your group. And first of all, there was COVID for me. I mean, it was absolutely clear that I couldn't avoid thinking about COVID because everybody was suffering from it pretty much all over the world. The other thing that was going on was there was really, really widespread political chaos during this time. The Black Lives Matter movement was really gaining strength in our town. I remember this because it was either just before or after I started chemo. Most of my neighbors went to the main street of Lexington and took a knee for George Floyd. And I remember all of us masked, of course, and socially distant. And when you're part of something like that, it's very hard to think of yourself being poor me, I'm having chemo. Poor me was being very, very well treated by a group of really extraordinary professionals. And that wasn't the case outside the hospital. Outside, a couple of my nurses and my doctors were people of color. And I often thought as I drove back and forth to the hospital, whether any of them were stopped because they were people of color. And that consciousness of what other people are doing while you're going through your thing, I think helped me a great deal. It's really important to remember two things when you're going through this cancer tunnel. One is that it's not happening just to you. It's happening to huge numbers of people who have cancer today. And the other thing is having cancer is one of many, many, many pieces of bad luck that can happen to you during a lifetime. And there are others that are going on simultaneously.
What I find so refreshing in what you're saying is your humility and your gratitude and your awareness of all this. And I know from our conversations and from your writing that children of Holocaust survivors sometimes feel disenfranchised, that their suffering, what they're going through, is nothing compared to what our parents have gone through. And a certain quality of stoicism uh, uh, gets imbued in children of survivors. But sometimes what goes along with that is a feeling that what I'm going through is not important. I'm not hearing that from you. And I think that part of healthy self-esteem, which supports resilience, is extremely important. I want to just ask you about this notion that so much was happening out there. So much was happening out there in the world, and so much was happening in your private world. And again, back to what we learned at September 11th, that if we don't limit how much input, how much stimulation, how much data comes in, that can become overwhelming and traumatizing in and of itself. And I think you've written about how important it is for you to take it one step at a time in the process. We know this from many other people. You exemplify this, and to limit the information. It's too easy to get addicted to the internet and Google everything that comes up. And that can be contraindicated. That can really make a person worse. Sometimes it's very important, but sometimes people just get overwhelmed because they don't have the background to navigate it. So, what was your strategy? How did you go about doing that?
I think I would call my strategy selective attention. There are lots of names for it. Some people would just say, oh, she was in denial or she was dissociated. But I think of it as selective attention. And let me give you a really good example of it, I think. most cancer patients who undergo chemotherapy are offered an option. They can get the transfusions, the infusions through their arms, or they can get what's called a portocatheter, which is essentially a hole that they make in your upper chest, and they put a catheter in there. And early on, I chose to have the port for a very simple reason. I knew I'd be sitting for 6 hours at a time with tubes going into my veins, and I didn't want to look at them. I wanted to be able to use my hands, to use the phone, to type, because I had my laptop with me in the infusion ward. And I literally did not want to see the chemo going into me. And when you have a port, it goes right under your chin and somehow bypasses your eyes. You don't have to look at it. So that was a really good example of selective attention. I chose to put my attention to diversion when I was in the chemo ward. I would talk to my nurse about it if I had questions. I'd say, well, how much am I getting today? Is it more? Is it less? How badly am I going to feel and when I leave here? But while I was there for those 6 hours, I really zoned out. I watched Hamilton 5 times on my iPad. I listened to a lot of music. I listened to a lot of opera. I did a lot of email. And all of this was without essentially acknowledging the chemo that I was receiving. So that's, I think, a great example of a power you have to decide what you're going to be attentive to.
I think that's a great example. You didn't fight it. You accepted it.
No.
You kind of knew it, but didn't want to know it. And I think that kind of adaptive compartmentalization, adaptive dissociation, whatever you want to call it, but that capacity to let it happen in a healthy way and trust. Again, I think trust is very, very important. You let it happen and you let your body accept the treatment and let your body do its thing.
But lest we think that I was a perfect patient, let me tell you when this breaks down. Anyone who's gone through chemo can tell you it's really hell. And it's particularly hell sort of midway in the cycle. And I found it extremely difficult. And I drove my husband crazy by not being a perfect patient. I didn't drink enough water. You have to drink 8 glasses of water every day, all the time. You have to move all the time. And the hardest thing for me, apart from those 2 things, was I could never accurately gauge how I was feeling. Usually, most of us know when we're feeling well or when we're feeling badly. But when you have chemo, you just feel awful all the time and you can't tell what's an emergency. And very often your blood count goes down so low that you can't move. You know, you find the slightest effort leaves you breathless. And there was this really, really difficult one time where I couldn't get out of the bathtub with my husband's help. And once I got out, I just keeled over. And I didn't know what's going on here. Am I dying, or is this just normal for chemo? And that, I think, I found was the hardest thing for me in the whole process, about losing a sense of being able to accurately gauge what was going on in my body. How dangerous was where I was? Was I close to dying? Was I not close to dying? Could I tell my doctor this or not? And I wound up asking my doctor, calling her on the emergency line and saying, has anyone died of chemotherapy? You know, which I felt terrible about asking, but that's where I was. I had to ask. And she said, no, do you feel like you're dying? And I said, I feel like I'm awfully close. And she basically decided to end my chemotherapy at 5 cycles and not take me to the full 6 cycles.
So many of us, if we're fortunate enough to have relative health and our body parts working fairly well, take our bodies for granted for much of our lives. We will something, it happens automatically. We move our arms and legs, our bowels, we breathe. We do it. Our bodies do what bodies do, and most of the time it works better if we try not to overthink. But during a serious illness and certainly major treatment like this, the body feels differently. This is really what you're talking about. And I guess depending on what kind of relationship a person has with their body beforehand, depends, influences how they handle things as they're going through something like this. And as I understand from so many people, depending on where they are in their chemotherapy cycle, they have to rest. They're exhausted. They come to realize for the first couple of days after the next infusion, I can't do anything. Then they start to feel better. As soon as they start to feel better, time for another treatment. So one has to renegotiate with one's body throughout. And as I see you smiling now so proudly, I realize that before we take it to the Q&A, because I know that it's very important that we hear from our attentive audience, your sense of humor. Amidst all of this, your wonderful sense of humor. How important is it? How have you cultivated it? How were you able to keep it? And can you teach it to others?
I think the real key is to be interested in other people. I'm a real extrovert. I've been told I'm one of the most gregarious people in the world, and I'm truly interested in other people. And but apart from that being a personality trait, it's an incredible defense mechanism when you're in a situation like having cancer, because you just focus your attention out and not in. And if you focus your attention out, you will see lots and lots of funny things happening all around you, because human beings are funny. I'll tell you one of the funniest things that happened, which I guess another patient would have taken as a real catastrophe. I had to go get a PET scan, which it involves drinking some awful liquid, and then within an hour, being photographed as that liquid goes through your body. And I went to a hospital that was in Newton, Massachusetts, to have this done. And I got there at 8:30 in the morning. I'm all prepped. They have the stuff ready for me. I'm sitting in the chair, and the doctor comes in terribly upset. The machine has broken down. And they're just absolutely in a tizzy about this. They don't know what to do. The nurse doesn't know what to do. And I said, I have an idea. Why don't you call up Mass General downtown in Boston and see if their machine is working? They probably have 2 or 3 of these machines. And I can drink the stuff here, and my husband will drive, and then we'll have the photographs done, the PET scan done in the central, the headquarters place. I thought this was a little weird that the patient was coming up with this plan, but I thought, I'm smart, and I'm dissociated, or I'm selectively attentive. So maybe that's why I can do this. So they agreed this was a very, very good idea. And then in what was a first in the last 10 years of my medical treatment, they scribbled down on a piece of paper, not in a computer, but on a piece of paper, the name of the place where I was going at the downtown Mass General, the name of the person I was to ask for, Steve, and the name and the name of the lab. There were several labs. So my husband and they said, sip the stuff slowly. Tell your husband to drive slowly as you drive to the hospital, because you want to be in this window of 1 hour. So I said, okay. And I thought this was very funny, which I think anybody thinks is very funny. So we get into the car, and I'm sipping this awful milky stuff. And I have this little piece of paper that says Steve, 2nd floor, and a phone number. So I get to Mass General, which is this huge, city-like place. It's got 80,000 people there. And I'm looking for Steve, and I get to this lab, and the lab says, I kid you not, which Steve do you want? But I didn't have his last name. I just had Steve. So they had to, and we're on a deadline, right? This has to happen before an hour is up, because otherwise the stuff is going to be in the wrong place when they take the PET scan. So to make a long story short, I laughed my way through the whole thing. And when I finally got to the PET scan place, I sat down and I was just giggling. And they looked at me and said, "What on earth is so funny?" And I said, "Well, if you had just gone through what I did, you'd be laughing too." So,
Eh, yeah,
bottom line, look outside yourself.
that's wonderful advice. And as you tell that story, I'm just reminded that with all of our great technological breakthroughs and AI and everything else, when in doubt, pencil and paper really saves the day. And uh, that's terrific. In the interest of time, I think we should take some questions. I see some that have come up on the chat. So let me toss a few of them your way, Helen, okay? What kinds of credentials were you looking for when you chose your medical team? And were there certain websites that you visited, or did you rely on referrals from doctors that you already knew?
That's a great question. I think the answer would depend on where you are in the country. I happen to be outside one of the best medical hubs in the world, which is Boston. And almost all the doctors in my medical network, which is Mass General, are unbelievably qualified. So I trusted my gynecologist implicitly. And when she asked me, "Would you like a referral?" I just said yes. And I took her referral. I assumed she would give me a great referral because she is a young woman. She's a young doctor. She's, I believe, in her early 40s. And I just followed her lead. I trusted her. And then once I met the surgeon, I trusted her too. I did check them, and my husband checked them. But I think possibly again because of the time pressure and because of COVID, I just didn't have the time or the mental space to worry it too much. If I had been in some rural area where I didn't have a wide choice of practitioners, perhaps I would have looked more carefully online and asked for recommendations from people who had gone through it successfully. But I didn't feel a need for that because of where I was. I think if you're in a large metropolitan center like New York or Austin, Texas, or San Francisco or Los Angeles, I think you can really, if you have a good primary care physician or if you have a good gynecologist, you can be secure that they will refer you to someone good. But I think you should trust your gut. And if you don't like the person you're referred to, look for another one.
I think more and more we rely on reviews and websites and these kinds of sources of information. I think especially younger people who are much more versed in the online world and social media. But the thing is, sometimes reviews for physicians and medical care are not quite as straightforward as they might be for, say, a restaurant. Uh, one example that was brought to my attention was some of the top cardiovascular surgeons working in urban areas with very, very sick tertiary care populations may not have as high of a survival rate from their procedures as someone in, say, a community hospital. So if you just look up the statistics of the survival rate of, say, one of these surgeons, and it's not as high as someone else, and you don't have the context, and you simply rely on that, that may be very misleading. So I think it's a combination of doing your homework and word of mouth from trust, from people that you trust. There's just no substitute for that.
Yeah, I definitely relied on word of mouth.
Yeah, yeah. Here's another question and appreciation. Thank you for sharing your experience. You spoke a lot about trusting your medical team and support system. Can you tell us more about trusting your gut? You must have anticipated this question, Helen. Did you read this? Or are you
I
just
did.
psychic? Did that come easily to you? Or did you need to run things by your support team and your partner?
Yes, I'm a person who trusts my gut. I think that's my personality, but it's also because I've been trained as a journalist. And when you're trained as a journalist, you're trained to trust your intuition, to really take a good look at people and really listen hard, and then draw your conclusions from them. And I have to say, I have trusted my gut with all of my doctors most of my life, and I've been quite right. And there have been doctors that I've left because I didn't feel they were very good. But in this case, I did go with my gut. The only place that my gut um, screwed up was with this radiation, because I was so prejudiced against radiation and I was so terrified of it, that it really clouded my judgment. But eventually, because nobody pressured me, I was able to come to an understanding that my idea of radiation was inaccurate. I mean, to give you an idea of what was going on, I actually wound up reviewing a book, choosing to review a book while I was in chemo about Hiroshima and John Hersey in Hiroshima, and how the United States government covered up some of the aspects of radiation illness. And I thought, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? This is just nuts. I have been in therapy, and I have to say psychoanalysis gave me tools that were very helpful to decipher some of my behavior around radiation.
Another question. Are there any questions that you recommend asking your medical team when one is diagnosed with cancer?
Well, actually, that radiation business,
Mhm.
instead of just obsessing about it by myself, I should have asked my surgeon, why do you recommend radiation? And how is it different from Chernobyl? And should I be worried about the effects it's going to have on me to the degree that I am? I think very often, because the amount of information is so overwhelming, you simply don't have the presence of mind to ask certain questions that become obvious to you later. So I think what my response would be to your question is, if a question bubbles up in you, 3 or 4 days after you've seen your doctor, don't hesitate to ask that question. Because if the doctor is open to you, she or he probably won't have understood that you didn't understand what they were saying. Because when you're in the doctor's office and you're getting hit with all this information, you just go, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. And if you're me, you write everything down. But that doesn't mean you've internalized it. And so there were several questions that came up afterwards that I had to ask. And I often didn't ask my doctor because I felt that I was imposing on her time. And so I wound up asking my infusion nurse. And she was very well trained, very well educated, and she was able to give me a lot of answers. And she was also able to say, you really have to ask the surgeon or the oncologist.
One of the questions that I think is coming up more and more because of the innovations in treatment is the sequence of procedures.
Hmm.
You had surgery, then chemo, and then radiation. And it might not have occurred to you to ask why the surgery first, because we now
Right.
know that in certain kinds of cancer treatments, the
Chemo.
chemo and the radiation may come
Right.
first
Right.
to try to shrink the tumor and then see what kind of surgery might be needed. But
Right.
again, that's part of being overwhelmed by everything. But again, there's infinite number of questions that can be asked. And apropos that, I think you say something in your book about an overall coordinator of or lack
Mhm.
thereof in your treatment team.
Yeah.
That was there one central person, general contractor, so to speak, that collated, organized, and everything went through that. And tell us about that.
There was not one person who did that. And that was the one critique I have of this fabulous Massachusetts General Hospital, which is perfect in every other way. I had 2 strokes right after I had my first chemo. And so, although I was at MGH, I was taken to Leahy Hospital because that was the closest to my house. I was taken, in an ambulance with a fire engine and the whole shebang. And I don't remember any of it. I was out of it. And so they had to coordinate between my stroke people and my chemo people. And there was really, and there was medication involved with both. I have to take Eliquis for my strokes, and I had to take other medications for my chemo. And there was really no one to talk to about this. And so a coordinator or a case manager would be really, really important. What I did in the end was I went to my primary care physician and I said, listen, I have nobody to talk to about coordinating all of this. Can I talk to you? And luckily she said yes. But not everybody is so lucky to have a primary care physician that says, yes, I will do this. And she didn't, she did it on a personal basis. She didn't really coordinate the different people. I know that some hospitals do have a case manager for exactly for this reason.
Yeah, the whole issue in your situation of chemotherapy related stroke and
Right.
how frequently that occurs, and should one be warned about every possible side effect that can happen, especially something as worrisome as a stroke, and how many preventive meds can a person be on, especially if their platelet counts may drop, if their white counts may drop. No one is necessarily going to put somebody preventively on an anticoagulant. But again, these are just some of the incredibly vexing and worrisome things that that can come up. So again, you saw the need for what you needed, a case manager, a coordinator, and you created it. And again, that's another example of resilience. You found and crafted something that you needed in the environment. We'll take one other question, and then we'll wrap it up and see if you have any final words of wisdom to us, Helen. Here's the last question. Do you have any hobbies or particular things you turn towards to stay positive during the journey?
Well, I'm a big music person, so I always listen to music. And I found as I get older, I get more and more visual. So I always spend a lot of time looking at art. And since you have very little energy when you're undergoing chemo, I just got out all my art books and I could barely hold them sometimes. And I would just stare at art. But music is much easier because you just listen to it. You just put on some earphones. I had 2 interests that I pursued during COVID, which were extremely pleasurable. One was here at 92Y. I signed up for Annette Insdorf's film class, and I had never studied film in college. I never took film history. And so I took, I think, 5 or 6 different sessions of Annette Insdorf, who teaches at film at Columbia. I took her class online. And the second thing that I just adored was I had started studying Italian before COVID. And I decided to continue studying it through chemo, through surgery, through radiation. And my poor Italian class watched me transform from a long-haired, straight-haired person to a bald person to a curly-haired person. And they seemed to be able to deal with it fine. And I progressed in Italian. And I have to say that as you're going through a really terrible treatment for a medical condition, the idea of progress in any field is enormously cheering. And I could see myself getting better and better and better at Italian. Sometimes when I had a really bad chemo reaction, I couldn't talk during the class, so I just listened. But I stuck with it. And I'm proud to tell you that I've read my first Italo Calvino short story in Italian.
I think perhaps your writing could be put to music for an Italian opera.
Oh,
I think you've been incredibly inspiring and so open with everyone here. I think it's truly a gift to us all. I think you would absolutely emphasize the importance of follow-up afterwards, after successful treatment. We must not forget that.
And never miss a checkup.